Hello and welcome to the Product People podcast. Here we learn from the most amazing people in the product space for 30 minutes at a time. At Product People, our mission is to help companies discover and deliver great products faster. We do that by doing hands-on product management work at companies of all sizes, and also by sharing knowledge generously with our community of more than 20,000 product enthusiasts. My name is João Moita, and today we have Radhika Dutt with us. Radhika comes from an engineering background at MIT, and she has been developing products since then. She's an entrepreneur and product expert, and she's also the author of the book Radical Product Thinking. She has been helping companies successfully apply this framework across the globe. I hope you enjoyed the chat as much as I did. Before we jump into Radical Product Thinking and to all the amazing things you've been developing and talking about, can you give us a bit of background on your career and also how you got into product management?
Yeah. So my track into product management has been actually more long and meandering as opposed to a straight shot. So my background is that I studied engineering at MIT. And then, we started our first startup right while we were still at school in dorms. And from that startup was where I realized product diseases happen so easily. So, this was back in 2000, where the startup that we had built, think of it like the early version of Siri, where you could interact with your device using voice as well as text. And this is back in the day, long before the iPhone came out in 2007, right? And so we thought that we were going to revolutionize wireless. That was, in fact, our vision statement. We were all about going big. And therein lies the first disease that I came across, which is hero syndrome. And what I realized was, as I was going through my career, I was learning from these mistakes and having experienced chronic diseases. And as I moved further up in my career, I realized that although I had learned from these diseases, I was then watching other people struggle with some of the same diseases. And no matter, how many industries I worked in. So, for example, in my career, I've worked in broadcast, media and entertainment, advertising, government, even wine, robotics. But across all of these and different sizes of companies, all the way from startups to multinationals, I kept seeing the same set of product diseases. And so that's what led me in 2017 to say, is it that we're just all doomed to learn through trial and error to build good products? Or is there a way we can take a step-by-step approach? Is there a framework we can create to give people the step-by-step approach so that anyone can build world-changing products without having to go through the same set of product diseases and trial and error? And so that's how radical product thinking was born. And so there you go. That's the summary of my experience and kind of what led to radical product thinking.
That's great. And that concept of product diseases is super interesting. Can you expand a little bit on that? And maybe also are some companies, some types of companies or sizes or either industries or sizes more prone to certain types of diseases and some others to other types? Can you give some examples of what those diseases are?
Yeah. So we talked about hero syndrome as one example of a product disease. Another one that I come across so often, which is especially common in startups, but also in other companies, is pivotitis. Especially in a startup, we have learned that the way you build a startup is just keep trying different things until you figure out what works. And unfortunately, that approach leads to pivotitis, where teams feel like they're facing this whiplash effect, where at first we're doing one thing, then the next day we're going to try something completely different, right? Another example of a product disease in a company that is sales led is the disease I call obsessive sales disorder. This happens when your salesperson comes to you with a glimmer in their eye and they tell you excitedly, we can win this mega client if you just add this one custom feature. And pretty soon you add a custom feature here, a custom feature there, and you're sitting with a whole roadmap that is completely driven by all these different contractual obligations you have.
Hmm. You end up
That's
with a Frankenstein kind of
exactly.
products.
Right. And so that is one disease that is super common with sales led organizations. And another disease that is really common with engineering led organizations is what I call narcissist complex, where we are so focused on our own internal goals or looking inwards to say, oh, I think the customer needs this, and so we build this shiny object that we think is so amazing, but then it turns out that's not what the customer actually needs. So that's narcissist complex. But by the way, all of these diseases can be common across any size of company, and whether you're engineering or sales led, sometimes organizations can actually be both.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, like, either engineering led or sales led eventually lead to some problems. What's the option that we have not to fall into those traps?
Yeah, both engineering led and sales led make it very hard to scale in the long term. So if you're engineering led, we're constantly just saying, okay, whatever the market wants us to build, we'll just go build that. Whatever the customer is asking for, let's just deliver it. Right. And the problem with that is you keep growing this Frankenstein of a product with obsessive sales disorder. You hit strategic swelling as well. Your product just keeps growing and growing and gets bloated. And it's hard to scale in the long run because even your customers start to get confused about what is your offering really. The opposite of that is engineering led, where we're building these shiny objects, but that leads to a very inefficient approach to innovation where we try lots of shiny things, and it's not necessarily what the customer truly wants. So sometimes in an engineering led organization, we see that our product is maybe doing well with a few maverick customers, but it has a hard time scaling beyond that and crossing the chasm. Right. And so, what is the alternative to both of these options? Many people have said, have called it product led. And I really dislike that term because the moment you say product led, what happens is it feels like it's a power struggle within the organization. You instantly face a lot of pushback from other parts of the organization saying, wait a minute, why are we being product led? So using that terminology in itself causes backlash. So what can you say instead? You can call it being vision driven. So instead of being sales led or engineering led, we can be vision driven, meaning that we have this clarity of vision and a deep understanding of what is the problem the customer is really facing and why is the status quo unacceptable. You'll hear so many entrepreneurs just say, oh, we should just disrupt, we'll just disrupt, and this way our product will be successful. It's not about disrupting for the sake of it. We have to be able to identify really why is the status quo absolutely unacceptable and why does it need to change? And without that clarity of definition, we don't have a clear enough vision to drive what our product is. And so being vision driven means having that clarity of vision and then very systematically translating that into a strategy, into priorities, and then how we measure success.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, basically, kind of this vision driven approach is a bit of a intersection. Like, still need to take some things into consideration. You cannot ignore sales or you cannot ignore engineering, but it's a bit of a combination of both in one direction. That makes sense. That's really good.
Exactly. The way I like to think about it is, when we all became agile and adopted agile as a methodology, we all learned that agile helps us go fast. So whether you're
Mhm.
engineering led or sales led, we were able to use agile to just all move fast. And
Yeah,
the problem with that was we were all moving fast, but in different directions. And so being vision driven, or, in other words, product led, which again, I would avoid, being vision driven means having all of these arrows point in the same direction so that you don't just have speed like with agile, but rather you have speed plus direction, which is velocity. And so when all of us are pointing in the same direction and we're moving forward, that's what really helps us move innovation forward.
cool. I really like the engineering analogies with the speed and velocity. Resonate a
You
lot.
can see my engineering
Yeah,
background.
definitely. That's great. Cool. So, what exactly is radical product thinking as a framework? What are the steps that it consists of? how does it help companies and teams move forward?
Radical product thinking is a methodology for building world changing products. And it's a 5 step process for building these world changing products. It means having a clarity of vision or the end state that we want to bring about, then a clear strategy for how do you translate vision into a set of actionable steps, then translating vision and strategy into priorities and how will you bring this vision and strategy into your everyday decisions and everyday activities, then translating all of that into execution, like for example agile sprints or waterfall, it doesn't matter, but translating it into execution and how you measure success, and then finally crafting a culture that is really conducive to innovation. So these are the 5 elements of radical product thinking. Now, when I say just these words like vision, strategy, etc., it might sound like, well, we've heard these words before. So what's so radical about it? And so that's where I want to talk a little bit to give you an example of what I mean by vision. That in the radical product thinking way, vision isn't something that we just write that's fluffy and broad and kind of pointless, like what we've learned. What we've learned about a good vision is it has to sound inspirational and it's a short tagline. So, for example, many companies have this vision of, we want to be the leader in aerospace engineering. That was Boeing's vision, for example, or leader in blah blah. Whatever that is, that's a useless vision because what does it mean to be a leader in that space? Do you count just revenue growth, or is it about having the biggest market share? Like, what is being the leader? And so that's a useless vision. So, in the radical product thinking way, a good vision means answering who, what, why, when, and how. I already talked about the why, which is, why is the status quo unacceptable? But before you get to the why, you have to answer whose world are you trying to change? Meaning, it can't be that you're creating this change for everyone. Like, describe like what is that group that for whom you're trying to change the world. The second is what is their problem? Meaning, what exactly is the issue and how are they solving it today? Then you can say, okay, why is that status quo unacceptable? Then how are you, like, what's the end state that you want to bring about? And finally, how are you going to bring it about? And so, this who, what, why, when, and how is what radical product thinking helps you answer in a fill in the blanks question so that you're not focusing on the words, but rather you're focusing on answering these really deep questions about your product and aligning the team on these questions so that, again, you have direction and everyone is aligned, pointing in the same direction as opposed to just moving fast in different directions. So, that
Yeah.
was one example of radical product thinking and why uh, elements of vision, strategy, etc., are different. But
Mhm.
similar to what I mentioned about vision, the strategy and what radical product thinking means in strategy is very different.
Mhm.
And each step is detailed.
Mhm. Maybe before we jump into strategy, like I'd like to dig a bit deeper on the vision part of things, because I think the way that you framed it is amazing and makes a lot of sense, especially when you think of a product that has direct impact on customers. That's like client facing and that or customer facing, user facing, basically. But sometimes for a lot of products it's quite difficult to craft a vision that is like kind of inspiring, or that you can articulate what's the change that the product is bringing to the world. Can you give some either example or way of thinking it on how you craft the vision for a product that's like not sexy and like hidden in the background of some corporate big product, for example? How would a team like that come up with a vision that works?
Yeah, great question. And I love that because, we often feel like our vision has to sound inspiring, like you are changing the world. And, when we sometimes artificially create a vision that sounds like that. So I'll give you an example. There was a company that was saying that their vision was to democratize justice and to make justice accessible for all and make it easier to access information about law or something like that for people. That sounded very, heroic and inspiring. In reality, their product was just used by huge law firms. So it wasn't in any way democratizing justice, right? But in saying this vision in a different way, they were catching hero syndrome because you make it sound righteous, but it didn't help align the team in any way. So let's talk about a really non sexy product. I'll give you an example where, as working with an organization, the product that we were talking about was on the back end. It was related to accounting. It was for the accounting team to make their job easier by making all the payment calculations simpler. And so, you know, instead of trying to make the vision sexy, just being honest and authentic is super helpful. So the way we addressed the vision was it all of their customers were internal customers. So the answer to the who was very specifically those internal customers who are the accounting team. What was their problem? The problem was this accounting team would spend crazy amounts of time at the end of the month to make payments that were due. And it was because of the systems that they had in place. And so these accounting people were really feeling burnt out for all the heroics that they had to jump through at the end of every month to close the books and pay out bills. So, why was the status quo unacceptable? Because these people were burning out and they had to keep replacing them. And that's not a good way of working. It led to a bad reputation for the company for not making payments on time. So the world envisioned was a system that makes payments so much simpler, automates a lot of the issues that the accountants were having to do manually. And they were bringing it about through this new upgraded accounting system that they were putting in place. Right. And now it may not sound sexy to everyone, but for the team working on this, it really helped articulate, why was their work so important? And it wasn't abstracted. It didn't talk about, the end customers who are like 5 layers removed from the internal customer. And so such a vision, when it's authentic, actually ends up being more inspiring for an internal facing team than artificially creating a vision that doesn't resonate for them.
Great. That's a great example to give an understanding on how to articulate. So it's not about the change that you'll make in the world in an aspirational way, but more how your product will change the life of someone, answering that who question, and being clear and honest about how it impacts. That's super cool. Nice. So maybe we can move to the next part of the framework, which is strategy. How do you generally frame the strategy?
Yeah, let's talk about the problem that I usually see in companies when we talk about strategy, right? The problem is usually I see strategy is handed to me as a 2-page document that says, oh, we're going to these 5 different markets and we're going to invest $10 million and our ROI is going to be this fantastic and the company is going to grow 20% as a result. And all of this sounds so fluffy and completely useless to product teams. So, good strategy instead is one that answers the following 4 questions. The first is, who's the persona for whom you're going to build out this product? Like, who needs to interact with the product for you to be able to bring about the vision that you talked about? So, starting with the personas, then you say, what is their pain point? What is the problem that makes them come to your product? Then you can talk about what's your solution and talk about the functionality that they will interact with to solve the problem. Then you can talk about the underlying engine that really helps you deliver on the promise of the solution. And then finally, logistics, meaning how do you bring the solution to customers? And this is where you can think about your business model, sales channels, how you will support and train on the system. Very often, logistics is the piece that we think, oh, first we'll build the product, then we'll think about logistics. And instead, we really need to think about it in this comprehensive way. And so, in the radical product thinking way, the mnemonic is RDCL, radical, which is real pain points, design, capabilities, and logistics. So, this sort of a radical strategy really gives clarity for the team in terms of what are we building to translate that vision into reality and how we're going to build it.
That's great. when you start moving to, okay, what exactly are we going to build and what are we going to prioritize? What's the way? How do you think about prioritization?
One of the hardest things about prioritization for product people is how do you convince stakeholders of what you think are the priorities? And how do you get everyone to understand your rationale for how you make decisions? The biggest advantage to doing prioritization the radical product thinking way is that it helps you spread your influence and your way of thinking across the organization. So, in the radical product thinking way, the way you do prioritization is you drop an X and a Y axis. Your Y axis is the vision. We talked about this clarity of vision so far. So, when you make that the Y axis, that's your long term. The X axis is your short term or survival. So, if you think about how you intuitively make decisions, you're constantly balancing the long term against the short term. And, even to give you an example, even when we were back in college, right, we would think about, well, do I go out and have fun with friends tonight or do I study for my exam tomorrow? So it's long term versus short term. So every product decision is the same. We're making this long term versus short term trade off. So when you draw up vision versus survival for your team, you're helping them visualize this trade off of long term versus short term. So now you can say, okay, this particular feature that we're thinking about, where does it fall on the long term versus short term? If it's helping you both with long term and short term, then, that is, of course, ideal. But, it's unfortunately the case that most things don't fall in that category. There are a few things if you're lucky, right? And even if you find everything in the ideal quadrant, if you just focus on ideal, it means you're constantly thinking about the short term. So sometimes you need to pull yourself away and do something that's investing in the vision, meaning it's good for the vision, but it's not helping you in the short term. So that's investing in the vision. Like, for example, if refactor code for 3 months, or if you're doing user research, you're investing in the vision. And the opposite of that is when you are taking on vision debt. We talked about the disease obsessive sales disorder. That happens when we're focused on the short term, like winning that sales deal, but it's not good for the long term vision. So the more vision debt you take on, eventually it causes obsessive sales disorder. And so the idea with prioritization in the radical product thinking way is when you're talking to your stakeholders or even to your team, draw up this X and Y axis and share with your team where the feature falls and why you should or should not do it. So you do some things from ideal, some things from investing in the vision, and some things for vision debt. And this way, you're getting everyone to understand your own trade offs so that even when your developer is meeting with his engineering manager, or your developer is making decisions and she's deciding whether to code things one way or the other, she knows how you're making decisions as opposed to having to make guesses, right? Like, everyone shares your same mindset, and that's what you want to do through prioritization.
That's super cool. I think it's a great way to think about it, that you always have some vision depth in order to like pay the bills at the end of the month. You just need to balance that depth, like the amount of vision depth that you have. Sometimes you have to pay up front, sometimes you can go a bit more for the short term. So that's a easy framework to think about it and to communicate it also. That's a great one.
And I love what you said about communication, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes if we take on vision debt, but we don't tell the team that, look, this is vision debt, it seems to the team that you don't care about the vision. So instead, when you tell the team that we have to pay the bills and that's why we're taking this vision debt, it helps them feel like you understand that this is vision debt and you care about the vision.
That's great. So, being vision driven can be associated with having a positive impact in the world, but it begs the question, how do you know that your impact is positive? And this can raise some ethical concerns. Can you share your perspective on the role of ethical decision making when building and managing products? How do you approach balancing these ethical concerns with business goals?
Yeah. And that's a great question. One of the first things I want to do is is clarify this idea of ethical decision making. Because what happens is when we use the word ethical decision making, people often interpret that as, you're going to be faced with a line in the sand and someone asks you to do something really bad and you heroically refuse to cross this line. And that's ethical decision making. In reality, what happens when you're building a product is you're never asked to do anything blatantly horrific. And it's so you never come across ethical issues per se. What happens instead is your product, through a series of many small decisions, ends up affecting society in a way that isn't ideal and in a way that is not creating equitable outcomes. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're building a product that is a checking account. That's simple, right? So it's a checking account that's a product, and you say that this checking account is for everyone. Let's say you structure this checking account so that there is a fee for the checking account, but you're willing to waive the fee as long as you keep a bank balance of, let's say, €1,000. Well, who pays the fee in that case? Typically, the people who aren't able to afford that bank balance are going to end up paying the fee. So, in that case, your product is creating a tax for poverty, and it's affecting rich people in such a way that they're going to be able to save more. So, is there anything unethical about this product? It's not unethical per se, but in the end, it's creating inequitable outcomes for society. So, the way I'd like to frame this is instead of thinking about it as ethical decision making, whether we're product leaders or we're product teams, developers, every one of us needs to think about the fact that our products are affecting society, and most likely they're affecting different parts of society differently. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, are our products creating equitable outcomes for society? And what it means to be ethical is to think very deliberately about how can I create equitable outcomes for society through my product. And so then next the question you were asking was, well, okay, so how do you balance creating these equitable outcomes with, thinking about profitability for your company? The two don't really have to be separate, right? Like, I'm not asking for every company to be altruistic. When you think about your strategy, think about the different personas. And this includes marginalized people who you might not have traditionally thought about. Like in this example of a checking account, think about who are the different personas who might use this product and how it affects them. And so when you use this framework of real pain points, design capabilities, and logistics, it helps you think about how you can bake equity into your product. And if there are concerns where you feel like this is going to affect profitability, think about that on an X and a Y axis where you think about vision versus survival. And if you're taking on vision debt, you have to note that. And for every occasion when you're taking on vision debt, think about when will you ever invest in the vision to create these equitable outcomes. So the first step in building all of these equitable products is at least being deliberate about it. And so this framework helps us think about how we can be more deliberate and take a step by step approach to thinking about equity and balancing vision versus survival for our companies.
Cool. What do you think is our responsibility as product people making decisions on what products to build in having a positive impact in the world? Because in a way, like if our success metrics are only focused on the business outcomes, or even in terms of vision, our vision can be quite focused on just a set of people, and we are impacting them in a positive way, and we are making money, but overall we are hurting society. What do you think philosophically is the role or should be the role of product people? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I feel like as product people, we hold power because we affect society through our products, right? And as Spider-Man's aunt said, with great power comes great responsibility. I really believe that. And so, as product people, we have to recognize how much power we have in how we affect society and that we have to take on that responsibility. Very often companies deflect responsibility by saying, well, we need regulations. But let's think about, how long regulations take to get enacted. If you look at environmental pollution, it literally took 300 years for regulations to get enacted. And these were regulations with teeth, right? And so, for regulations to get enacted on all of these digital laws, it's going to take a long time. And so, companies feel like they can just deflect responsibility and not have to think about how their product is affecting society until regulations. And that's not fair. The other way that companies deflect responsibility is by saying people can vote with their dollar. But the reality is, people cannot vote with their dollar, especially because companies are getting larger and more like monopolies. So you don't have the choice to vote with your dollar. So, where is the power of the vote? It's product people, it's product teams, it's people working in these companies. We have the power to vote with our labor. We vote with our labor for the world that we want to create. And so we have the responsibility to use that vote very carefully to design the world we want to create through our work.
Nice. That's a interesting way to think about it. It's both scary and inspiring at the same time. But yeah, that's a good framing. Nice. One thing about radical product thinking is that it involves a lot of the vision and the strategy part, which not always fall under the product manager individual contributor. How do you see that individual contributor can impact the organization through radical product thinking, even if they are not empowered by their organization by default?
Yeah. One of the reasons this framework exists is so that this helps individual contributors usurp some power. Because what happens often is you take on a product management role and you hope and you would think that it's a strategic role, but maybe the leadership team says to you, we have a vision and strategy. You just focus on the execution. They try to tell you that this is just a tactical role for you, right? How do you then take ownership of the vision and strategy? One of the first things you can do is use this framework for a vision to write out a vision for your product. Even if someone else is setting the vision for the company, setting the vision even for the product, but if they have created a vision at this high level of being a leader in blah blah, or disrupting robotics by doing blah, like, that's not a useful vision. So you can work on a detailed vision that is going to help inspire your team. And I'll give you the example of one company where I was working, where the leadership didn't have clarity of vision or strategy. But, one of the things that made the work environment so fantastic was we had a great team where I was able to share this vision and strategy for the team. And we had our mini culture where it was our team had this fantastic culture with this clarity, and we were operating all together in this, arrows aligned together manner, whereas the rest of the company might have been a mess, but it didn't matter. So as a result, we had very little attrition within our team because we had this clarity of vision. And so even if you're an individual contributor, you have the power to give your team that clarity.
Cool. That's great and a great way to wrap up our episode. Before we go, how can people learn more about radical product thinking and maybe get access to some tools that might be useful?
There's the book, the Radical Product Thinking book, which is on Amazon and any bookstore near you. You can also download the free toolkit. It's radicalproduct.com. And then lastly, people are welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I always love to hear how people are creating change using radical product thinking. So you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
That's great. Radhika, thank you so much for the conversation. It was really inspiring and insightful, and I hope you also had a good time.
Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this Product People podcast episode. Make sure to follow our show on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss the upcoming conversations with inspiring product leaders. We'd be really happy if you can rate our show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or if you share it with someone who might find it interesting. To find out more about us and access our community, check our website, getproductpeople.com, or head over to our YouTube, LinkedIn, or Meetup pages. You can find all the links in the episode description. See you next time.